Hey there, welcome. Tonight, we'll journey together through 4 extraordinary chapters, exploring the autumn shadows and flickering lights of Hawkins, Indiana, as darkness returns and heroes rise to meet it. As you settle into your comfortable space, let the gentle flow of this story carry you into peaceful dreams. Every episode holds its own revelations, its own moments of courage and connection waiting to unfold. The final season of Stranger Things began on November 26th, 2025, with Volume 1 bringing the first 4 chapters of an ending 9 years in the making. These episodes, set in November 1987, 18 months after the gates tore through Hawkins, weave together mysteries old and new. So let's begin where all great stories return, to the moment that started everything, a memory hidden in darkness that would reshape everything they thought they understood about Will Byers and the monster who took him. On November 12, 1983, 6 days after Will Byers vanished into the night, the boy found himself trapped in a dimension where shadows breathed and terror walked on legs that shouldn't exist. This moment, hidden from viewers for nearly a decade, opened Season 5 with a revelation that reframed everything audiences believed they understood about Will's disappearance and the monster who orchestrated it. The scene began inside Castle Byers, the makeshift fort Will had built in his backyard, now existing as a twisted echo within the Upside Down. Digital de-aging technology returned Noah Schnapp to his 11-year-old appearance, capturing the vulnerability and determination that had defined Will's original ordeal. The boy sang "Should I Stay or Should I Go" by The Clash to steady himself. The same song his brother Jonathan had shared with him, the same melody that had connected him to Joyce during those desperate days of searching. The Demogorgon approached. Will fired the rifle he'd taken from the Byers' home, the shots echoing through the decayed dimension without deterring the creature. He ran through landscapes that mimicked Hawkins, while simultaneously corrupting every familiar detail. Trees became skeletal, the air hung thick with spores and particles that drifted like snow made of ash. Will climbed desperately, seeking height as escape, but the bark crumbled beneath his hands, and he fell hard to the ground below. Unconscious, Will offered no resistance as the Demogorgon gathered him carefully, almost gently, in its grotesque arms. The creature moved with purpose rather than hunger, carrying the boy through the twisted forest to a destination that had been waiting. Vecna stood there, not yet the burned and broken figure audiences had seen at the end of Season 4, but already monstrous in form and intention. His presence dominated the space, ancient malevolence wearing flesh like an ill-fitting costume. Vecna spoke to the unconscious child with terrible intimacy. He told Will that their plan could finally begin, that together they would do such beautiful things. The words carried ownership, possession disguised as partnership. Tentacles emerged from the fleshy walls surrounding them, organic extensions of the Upside Down itself responding to Vecna's will. One tentacle, tipped with a proboscis that pulsed with bioluminescent horror, forced its way into Will's mouth, pumping unknown substance directly into the boy, while he remained helpless to resist. This violation explained what 4 previous seasons had only hinted at. Will's possession by the Mind Flayer in Season 2 hadn't been the beginning of his connection to the Upside Down. That connection had been established here, in November 1983, when Vecna deliberately infected the boy with something that would tie them together across years and dimensions. The slug Will coughed up at the end of Season 1 was merely symptom, not cause. The true binding had occurred in this moment, Vecna's influence woven into Will's very cells. The scene carried weight beyond its immediate horror. It demonstrated that Will's abduction wasn't random hunting by a mindless creature. The Demogorgon had been following orders, executing a plan that required this specific child from this specific family in this specific town. Vecna had chosen Will deliberately, seeing in the sensitive, artistic boy exactly the qualities he needed. The vulnerability that made Will a target for bullets, like Troy and James, had also made him perfect for Vecna's purposes. The revelation recontextualized every moment of Will's struggle since that November night. His ability to sense the Mind Flayer's presence in Season 2 wasn't just residual connection from brief possession. His goosebumps whenever the Upside Down drew near, his feeling that something in him had never fully returned from that dimension, his certainty that moving to California had provided relief only because distance weakened the signal. All of this pointed to a bond forged intentionally, a connection Vecna had planted and nurtured across years. The Duffer brothers had confirmed in interviews that revealing this moment was essential to Season 5's emotional arc. Will's journey from victim to hero required understanding that his connection to Vecna wasn't accident or weakness, but the foundation for power that would eventually save his friends. The boy who sang to keep fear at bay would grow into someone who could turn that very fear into weapon against its source. The technical achievement of the scene deserved recognition. The digital de-aging, handled by the same teams who had aged actors like Robert De Niro and Will Smith in other productions, maintained emotional authenticity while restoring youthful features. Noah Schnapp's adult performance informed the digital creation, allowing genuine fear and determination to shine through the technological wizardry. The Upside Down's design, refined across 5 seasons, achieved its most haunting iteration here, familiar enough to recognize while strange enough to unsettle. This opening established Season 5's thesis that endings require returning to beginnings, that understanding the present demands confronting the past, that victory over darkness begins with accepting the marks it left behind. Will's story had always been the heart of Stranger Things, and this moment confirmed that the final season would honor that primacy. The calendar turned forward, seasons passed, and November returned to Hawkins once more. By November 3rd, 1987, 18 months after the gates tore Hawkins apart, the town existed under a veil of enforced normalcy that fooled no one who lived there. The rifts that had split the earth remained, though now covered by massive steel plates that the military had welded over the wounds like industrial bandages. Children used them as skateboarding ramps until soldiers shouted them away. The metal groaned at night when temperatures dropped, an unsettling metallic keening that reminded residents of what lay beneath. The military access control zone dominated central Hawkins. Locals called it the Mac Zed, though some preferred Big Mac for the dark humour of comparing an interdimensional gateway to fast food. Fencing surrounded the convergence point where Vecna's 4 gates had met, creating a no-man's land patrolled by soldiers who carried weapons designed for threats beyond human comprehension. The open portal to the Upside Down existed within that perimeter, a wound kept deliberately accessible for reasons the military refused to explain. Quarantine meant no one entered or left Hawkins without military authorization. Roadblocks manned by armed personnel turned away anyone attempting departure. The official explanation painted the situation as necessary containment of an unprecedented geological event, a natural disaster that had released dangerous gases requiring study and mitigation. Most residents knew better, but survival meant accepting convenient lies over dangerous truths. The Byers family had returned from California only to find their home uninhabitable, damaged beyond quick repair by the earthquakes that weren't earthquakes. The Wheelers had opened their doors, an act of generosity that strained both families as privacy evaporated and personal space became luxury. Joyce and Karen navigated shared kitchens with careful politeness. Ted retreated to his recliner with increased frequency. The children adapted, as children do, though the arrangement reminded everyone that normal had become a concept rather than reality. Robin Buckley and Steve Harrington had found employment at WSQK, the local radio station that had become Hawkins' primary information source during the crisis. Robin hosted the Morning Squawk, her natural wit and Steve's easy charm, creating a show that entertained while subtly passing coded messages to those who knew how to listen. Nancy Wheeler managed the station, her journalism background proving invaluable for controlling narrative in a town where truth and fiction had become dangerously intertwined. The station served a dual purpose, broadcasting approved content for general consumption while facilitating communication for those working against darker threats. Missing person posters featuring Jane Hopper appeared throughout town, her photograph staring from telephone poles and shop windows. The military had declared 11 a person of interest, wanted for questioning about the events that had devastated Hawkins. They believed she had caused the catastrophe, that her powers had opened the gates. The irony was bitter for those who knew the truth. 11 had saved the town repeatedly, but official narrative required a scapegoat, and a teenage girl with unexplained abilities fit that role perfectly. Mandatory medical checkups occurred weekly at facilities the military had established throughout town. Residents lined up for examinations that seemed designed to detect something beyond normal health concerns. Blood samples were taken and catalogued. Neurological tests measured responses to stimuli that felt specifically tailored to identify psychic ability. Anyone displaying unusual results faced additional scrutiny, making those with knowledge of the supernatural careful to present as aggressively ordinary. Soldiers outnumbered civilians in certain areas, their presence a constant reminder of occupation disguised as protection. They patrolled with purpose, watching for threats both terrestrial and otherwise. Some had been briefed on Hawkins' true history, trained to recognize signs of interdimensional incursion. Others simply followed orders, confused by protocols that seemed to expect monsters rather than criminals. The informed and ignorant worked side by side, creating an atmosphere of tension that permeated every interaction. Hawkins High School functioned under the new normal, though education competed with trauma for student attention. Dustin Henderson faced daily harassment for refusing to abandon Eddie Munson's memory. He wore his Hellfire Club shirt with defiant loyalty, despite knowing it painted a target on his back. Andy and his friends saw Eddie as the freak who had brought catastrophe to Hawkins, and anyone defending him deserved similar contempt. Mike Wheeler, Lucas Sinclair, and Will Byers stood with Dustin, though they quietly wished he would choose different battles. Eddie's grave had been vandalized repeatedly, obscenities painted across the headstone by those who believed he had been responsible for the deaths attributed to Vecna's curse. Dustin visited regularly, cleaning the damage and leaving fresh flowers that would be destroyed within days. His grief remained raw, compounded by the knowledge that Eddie had died a hero while the world remembered him as a villain. The injustice burned, but grief offered no outlet for that particular fire. The town's official explanation for recent events strained credibility but provided necessary fiction. An unprecedented seismic event, officials claimed, had released gases from deep earth that caused mass hallucinations explaining the strange sightings residents reported. The gates were geological phenomena, the deaths tragic accidents during chaotic evacuation. This narrative satisfied no one who had experienced the truth, but it allowed life to continue with some semblance of structure. Robin's relationship with Vicky had deepened during the crisis, their connection forged through shared danger and mutual recognition. They navigated their relationship carefully in a town where being different invited scrutiny, but found moments of happiness in the spaces between catastrophe. The radio station provided cover for their time together, professional collaboration hiding personal connection from those who might use it as weapon. Hopper's rules for the group were simple and inflexible. Stay quiet, blend in, focus on the mission. Drawing attention risked exposure, and exposure endangered everyone. They operated in shadows by necessity, their heroism unrecognized by a population that would never know how close to extinction they had come. This anonymity chafed, particularly for younger members who had sacrificed normal adolescence for endless vigilance. The town breathed uneasily beneath military presence and steel plates, pretending normalcy while everyone waited for the next catastrophe. Beneath the surface of this strained routine, a secret operation continued in the shadows. The operation they called the Crawl represented both desperate hope and calculated risk, a systematic search through nightmare dimensions for a monster they prayed was dead. The name came from Dungeons and Dragons terminology, those methodical explorations through dungeon corridors where adventurers checked every room for threats. Here the dungeon was the Upside Down, and the threat wore human form, twisted into something far worse. The military conducted what they termed burns, scheduled breaches where they forced open pathways through the gate to transport supplies into their upside-down facility. These burns created brief windows of opportunity, moments when the portal stood accessible and military attention focused elsewhere. Hopper used these windows to slip through undetected, entering the dimension that had once held him prisoner to search for the creature that threatened everyone he loved. Each crawl followed precise protocol developed through trial and error. Robin broadcast coded messages during the morning squawk, innocent-sounding chatter about weather and local events that contained specific information for those listening carefully. When Diana Ross's Upside Down played during her show, the signal activated. Hopper prepared for entry. The surface team moved to their positions. Everyone understood their role in the coordinated effort that had become routine through repetition. Hopper moved through the Upside Down methodically, covering one section of the inverted town during each mission. He searched through the twisted version of Hawkins, street by street, building by building, seeking any sign that Vecna had survived the fire that had consumed him at the end of their last confrontation. The group tracked his progress from the surface using equipment Murray Bauman had modified from military surplus, maintaining communication through methods that bypassed normal channels. The surface coordination required multiple locations and careful timing. Steve and Dustin typically monitored from Steve's car, equipment spread across the dashboard and back seat. Jonathan and Nancy provided backup from the radio station, ready to create distractions if military presence threatened discovery. Mike, Lucas, and Will maintained watch from various positions around the MACZ perimeter, their youth making them less suspicious to patrolling soldiers who dismissed teenagers as harmless. 37 crawls had been completed before the events of Episode 1, 37 missions where Hopper ventured into hostile territory, searched designated areas, and returned safely through the gate before military personnel could detect his presence. The pattern had created false confidence, a belief that they had developed a system that worked, that they controlled variables in an inherently chaotic situation. 11 trained in secrets at a junkyard on Hawkins' outskirts, the rusted vehicles and piled scrap providing both concealment and obstacles for the combat course Hopper had designed. She practiced the physical conditioning that complemented her mental abilities, understanding that power meant nothing without the endurance to deploy it effectively. Joyce supervised these sessions, offering encouragement while worrying that preparation for war would become the war itself. Hopper refused to allow 11 to accompany him on the crawls, despite her arguments that her abilities made her the most qualified for the mission. His protective instincts overrode tactical logic. She had died once already, her heart stopping before he revived her. He would not risk that again, even knowing that refusing her participation meant entering the Upside Down without the one weapon that could actually defeat Vecna, should they encounter him. Will's role in the operation was more passive, but equally crucial. His connection to the Upside Down, that lingering bond from his possession and earlier infection, made him sensitive to fluctuations in the dimension's activity. He felt goosebumps when portals opened nearby. he sensed disturbances in the fabric separating worlds. His awareness provided early warning of threats the equipment might miss, though using him as sensor troubled everyone who understood what that connection represented. The searches found nothing. Hopper moved through the Upside Down's corrupted landscape, checking locations where Vecna might hide or recover from injuries, discovering only emptiness and decay. 11 attempted to sense the creature, psychically, reaching into the dimension with her. Consciousness, finding no trace of his presence, Will felt nothing through their shared connection, no indication that Vecna's attention focused on Hawkins or its inhabitants. This absence created uncertainty more troubling than confirmed presence. If Vecna had survived, where had he gone? If he had died, why did the Upside Down remain active, its gates still open? The lack of evidence either way left them trapped in limbo, unable to move forward with their lives, while unable to confirm the threat had ended. Each crawl hoped for closure, found only questions. The group understood that their operation balanced on knife's edge. Discovery by the military would end everything, exposing 11 to capture and destroying their ability to operate independently. The town's residents, had they known about these secret missions, might have demanded they stop, might have seen the risk as reckless endangerment rather than necessary vigilance. Secrecy protected the operation, but also isolated them, making every decision feel weighted by consequences no one else would understand. The false comfort of routine would shatter during the 38th crawl. While Hopper prepared for another descent, a different threat emerged in the daylight world. Holly Wheeler, youngest of the Wheeler children, carried a secret that her family dismissed as childhood imagination, but which would prove more terrifying than any monster they had faced. The girl had recently turned 7, an age where imaginary friends often appear as companions for lonely children navigating complex worlds. Her family saw Mr. Whatsit as precisely that, a harmless invention born from isolation and an active imagination. The recasting of Holly for Season 5 signalled her elevated importance to the narrative. Nell Fisher replaced the twins who had portrayed younger Holly in previous seasons, bringing the acting ability necessary for a character who would carry substantial emotional weight. Fisher's Holly possessed both the vulnerability expected of a 7-year-old and an underlying resilience that would prove crucial as events unfolded. Mr. Whatsit had appeared to Holly months before the events of Episode 1. The name itself referenced A Wrinkle in Time, Madeline L'Engle's classic novel about children fighting cosmic darkness with the help of mysterious guardians. In that story, Mrs. Whatsit was a celestial being who aided protagonists against evil. Holly's Mr. Whatsit claimed similar protective purposes, presenting himself as guardian against the monsters he warned were coming for Hawkins. The figure appeared only to Holly, invisible to parents, siblings, and teachers who attributed his presence to the active fantasy life of a creative child. He dressed formally in what Holly described as old-fashioned clothing, spoke with gentle authority about dangers he alone could perceive, and promised her that following his guidance would keep her family safe from threats they couldn't understand. These promises built trust gradually, establishing relationship through consistency and apparent concern. Holly's family had experienced enough supernatural horror to take unusual behaviour seriously under normal circumstances. However, the distinction between trauma response and legitimate warning proved difficult for parents already stretched thin by extraordinary circumstances. Karen and Ted had opened their home to the Byers family, managed the stress of military occupation, and tried to maintain normalcy for children who had seen too much. When Holly spoke of her protective friend, they interpreted this as a coping mechanism rather than warning signal. Mike showed more concern for his sister's claims than their parents demonstrated. He remembered his own encounters with the Upside Down. the way adults had dismissed his explanations until evidence became undeniable. He gave Holly a Dungeons and Dragons figure for comfort, a small paladin meant to protect her when fear made Mr. Watsit's promises feel insufficient. The gesture represented the bond between siblings who understood that monsters were real even when parents needed to believe otherwise. Teachers at Holly's school noted her conversations with an invisible companion, but saw nothing alarming in the behaviour. Many children her age engaged in similar play, creating elaborate scenarios with imaginary participants. The counsellor who spoke with Holly found her well-adjusted despite recent trauma, displaying normal emotional responses and age-appropriate social skills. The imaginary friend seemed like healthy processing rather than concerning symptom. Holly herself believed completely in Mr. Watsit's reality and benevolence. He appeared to her with the solidity of any person, spoke with her about fears and hopes, and demonstrated knowledge of things she hadn't told him, proving he was more than her own thoughts externalized. When he warned about monsters in Hawkins, she trusted these warnings because her family's secretive behaviour suggested hidden dangers they refused to discuss with her. The character of Mr. Watsit showed sophisticated understanding of child psychology. He never demanded anything that would alarm adults. He encouraged Holly to listen to her parents, to follow rules, to be good. His influence manifested in increased anxiety about her family's safety rather than rebellious behaviour. This subtlety made him seem like the worried part of Holly's own mind rather than external manipulation. The bedroom Holly occupied in the Wheeler house became her primary interaction space with Mr. Watsit. She would sit on her bed, having conversations that looked like a child talking to herself, asking questions and pausing as if listening to responses. Karen occasionally stood outside the door, listening to these one-sided discussions, troubled by their content but uncertain whether intervention would help or harm her daughter's emotional processing. Nancy recognised something familiar in Holly's descriptions of Mr. Watsit. The way Holly insisted he was real, despite no one else seeing him, reminded Nancy of Barb's disappearance, of the way reality had proven stranger than anyone wanted to believe. She made mental notes of Holly's comments, filing them away as potentially significant, even while hoping they represented nothing more than a phase that would pass with time. The imaginary friend who promised protection would soon reveal intentions far more sinister than a child's mind could comprehend. As Holly slept in false security, the 38th crawl began. The 38th crawl shattered the illusion of control, transforming careful plan into desperate survival within moments. November's evening had settled over Hawkins with the particular darkness that comes when autumn slides toward winter, the air sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Diana Ross finished singing about being upside down, the coded signal transmitted, and the operation moved into its familiar choreography. Dustin Henderson was notably absent from his usual monitoring position. Earlier that afternoon, he had visited Eddie Munson's grave alone, a weekly pilgrimage he made despite knowing the site would likely be vandalised again. Andy and his friends had been waiting, their ambush planned with the casual cruelty that teenage bullies mistake for strength. They had beaten Dustin while hurling accusations about his dead friend, leaving him bruised and bleeding among the scattered flowers he'd brought. The group learned of Dustin's situation, too late to prevent the assault, but in time to complicate the crawl. Steve and Jonathan took over his monitoring duties, spreading equipment between them while trying to cover responsibilities designed for 3 people. The hastily reorganized coordination meant gaps in their coverage, blind spots in awareness that would prove consequential. Hopper moved through the woods toward the Makiza perimeter using paths he had memorized through repeated use. The underground tunnels that Will and the group had discovered in Season 2 provided hidden routes beneath the military's surveillance, passages that predated the recent occupation and remained unknown to soldiers who thought in terms of surface security. These tunnels, lined with the decaying vines of the Upside Down's previous incursion offered concealment despite their unsettling organic walls. The military convoy rolled toward the gate on schedule, trucks loaded with supplies for the Upside Down facility that had been established within the alternate dimension. Soldiers rode in the vehicles, their weapons ready for threats they had been trained to recognize without fully understanding. The Burns opened the portal at precisely the moment Murray had predicted through careful observation of military patterns, the gate yawning wide as fire consumed the flesh-blocking passage. Hopper infiltrated the convoy with practiced efficiency, slipping between vehicles during the moment of organized chaos as soldiers focused on securing the perimeter and preparing for transit. He hid within a transport truck carrying construction materials, surrounded by steel beams and concrete that would shield him from casual inspection. The convoy moved forward through the gate, crossing from Hawkins into its twisted reflection. The Demogorgon's attack came without warning. One moment the convoy moved through the Upside Down's corrupted landscape, vehicles maintaining formation along roads that echoed their surface counterparts. The next moment, violence erupted as the creature launched itself from hiding with speed that defied its considerable mass. The lead vehicle flipped, soldiers thrown clear as metal crumpled like paper. The Demogorgon tore through the convoy methodically, its flower-like head opening to reveal rows of teeth that closed on flesh and bone with terrible efficiency. Screams filled the air, cut short as the creature demonstrated why it had been feared as the primary threat before Vecna revealed himself as architect rather than mere monster. Hopper scrambled from his hiding place as the truck carrying him was struck, metal shrieking as the vehicle tilted dangerously. He rolled clear, hitting the ground hard enough to drive air from his lungs. Soldiers fired on the Demogorgon with weapons that would kill any earthly threat, but the creature shrugged off bullets that tore through its flesh without finding vital organs that might be where humans expected them. Military personnel died quickly, their training insufficient against a predator, evolved in a dimension where normal rules of biology and physics bent toward nightmare. Hopper found himself the sole survivor within minutes, surrounded by bodies and burning vehicles, facing a creature that had already demonstrated its ability to kill trained soldiers with ease. He ran, abandoning stealth for speed, seeking any route back to the gate before it closed. Back on the surface, Will collapsed at the radio station, where he had been waiting with Joyce and Robin. His body went rigid, eyes rolling back as connection he couldn't control seized him completely. Through the link forged years ago by Vecna's infection, Will experienced the Demogorgon's perspective, seeing through its eyes as it hunted through the wreckage. The vision felt different from previous episodes. Will didn't merely observe the creature's actions, but experienced its thoughts, its hunger, its purpose. He understood the Demogorgon wasn't acting on instinct, but following orders, hunting with intention rather than random aggression. Through this forced connection, Will sensed the intelligence directing the attack, felt Vecna's presence guiding the creature's violence. Joyce held her son as he convulsed, his nose bleeding from the strain of the connection. She had seen this before, during his possession, in Season 2. Knew the signs of the Upside Down reaching through him. Robin called for help on the radio, abandoning code as Emergency Overrode Protocol, alerting Steve and Jonathan that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Steve and Jonathan watched their monitoring equipment with growing alarm as signals indicated chaos at the gate location. The telemetry from Hopper's concealed tracker showed erratic movement, the kind of pattern that suggested flight rather than controlled progress. They attempted radio contact, received only static and distant sounds that might have been screaming. Hopper emerged from the Upside Down, barely ahead of the Demogorgon, throwing himself through the portal as it began to close. The creature pursued but stopped at the threshold, reluctant or unable to cross fully into the human world. Hopper collapsed on the Hawkins side, injured from the escape, surrounded by military personnel who rushed toward the commotion with weapons raised. Will recovered from his vision to find Joyce's face close to his own, her fear evident despite attempts to hide it. He told her what he'd seen: the convoy's destruction, the deaths, the Demogorgon's controlled hunt. More troubling, he described the sensation of thinking through the creature's mind, of understanding its purpose not through observation, but through temporary fusion of consciousness. The group absorbed Will's revelation with dread. His connection to the Upside Down, that bond they hoped had weakened with time and distance, had instead evolved into something more complex. He wasn't simply sensing the dimension's activity, he was linking with the hive mind that connected Vecna to his creatures, becoming unwitting spy in a war where information meant survival. Hopper remained trapped in the Upside Down as the first crawl to end without return, while Will's connection revealed itself as both gift and curse. The group absorbed this catastrophe, but they had no time to process what it meant. Another horror was already unfolding in the Wheeler home. The portal that opened in Holly Wheeler's ceiling on that November night brought nightmare directly into the heart of family safety, shattering forever the illusion that home offered protection. Episode 1 had ended with the ceiling splitting, a Demogorgon's clawed hand reaching through as Holly stared upward in frozen terror. Episode 2 began precisely where that horror left off, the creature forcing its way into her bedroom with violence that seemed amplified by the domestic setting. Holly ran. The instinct drove her from her bed toward the bathroom where Karen had just drawn a bath, intending a rare moment of relaxation after a day managing too many people in too small a space. The girl burst through the door, screaming about the monster in her room, blood already on her pajamas, though not yet her own. Karen's first instinct was comfort, pulling Holly close, but the flickering lights and the child's genuine terror overrode dismissal. The Demogorgon crashed through the bathroom door with force that sent wood splinters across tile. Karen saw it fully. Then, the creature from the dimension that had destroyed so much of their lives, standing in her home with clear intention toward her youngest child. The maternal instinct that had driven Karen through years of mundane parenting transformed into something primal and fierce. Karen grabbed the wine bottle she'd brought for her bath, the glass still full of red that would never be drunk. She smashed it against the sink's edge, creating a jagged weapon that fit her hand with desperate improvisation. When the Demogorgon lunged toward Holly, Karen attacked with the broken bottle, stabbing at the creature's torso with strength she didn't know she possessed. The scene played against ABBA's Fernando, drifting up from the living room where the radio had been left on, the cheerful melody creating dissonance with the violence unfolding upstairs. The Duffer Brothers had used this technique throughout Stranger Things, pairing horror with incongruously upbeat music to heighten emotional impact. Here the song about friendship and remembering better times scored a mother fighting for her child's life. Karen's assault with the broken bottle drew the creature's attention away from Holly. The Demogorgon's hide proved tougher than human flesh, but the glass found purchase in areas where previous damage had weakened its natural armor. The creature bled, dark fluid that steamed when it hit the bathroom floor, evidence that Karen's desperate defense was inflicting actual harm. Ted Wheeler had been in the backyard hitting golf balls into the trees, a stress relief activity he'd taken up since the earthquakes, that weren't earthquakes, had made normal life impossible. He noticed the house lights flickering in the pattern that he'd learned meant something wrong was happening inside. He ran toward the house, carrying his golf club, the 7-iron that had been in his hands when he'd noticed the disturbance. Ted's arrival in the bathroom doorway provided enough distraction for Karen and Holly to surface from where they'd submerged in the tub, hiding beneath water while the creature searched for them. His shout of confusion and fear pulled the Demogorgon's attention toward new threat. Ted swung the club with what the Duffer Brothers would later describe in interviews as the best swing of his life, connecting solidly with the creature's head. The golf club's impact merely angered the Demogorgon rather than harming it significantly. The creature backhanded Ted with casual violence, sending him crashing through the bathroom wall into the hallway beyond. He lay still among the debris, conscious but stunned, unable to rise as Karen pulled Holly from the tub and ran for the stairs. They made it to the kitchen before the next portal opened, this one manifesting in the ceiling above the breakfast nook, where the Wheeler family had shared countless meals. The Demogorgon dropped through with predatory grace, blocking their path to the front door. Karen pushed Holly behind her, preparing for another fight with nothing but broken glass and determination. The creature moved toward them with purpose rather than hunger. Its behavior suggested mission rather than mindless attack, objectives beyond simple violence. When it reached for Holly specifically, ignoring Karen except as obstacle to be removed, the targeting became undeniable. This wasn't random assault, but orchestrated abduction. Karen fought again, stabbing at the creature's reaching arms, creating wounds that slowed but didn't stop its advance. The Demogorgon's claw caught her across the chest, tearing through clothing and flesh with efficiency that left Karen bleeding heavily. She collapsed against the kitchen counter, still trying to place herself between monster and daughter, but her body no longer responded to commands. Her will was screaming. Holly struggled as the Demogorgon grasped her, the girl's screams piercing the night as the creature pulled her toward the portal that hung open above them. She reached for her mother with desperate hands, finding only air as distance grew between them. The last thing Karen saw before consciousness left her was her daughter being drawn into the dimensional rift, vanishing into darkness that should never have touched her home. Nancy and 11 arrived within minutes, Nancy having received Steve's panicked radio call about something happening at the Wheeler house. They found Karen on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood, Ted staggering down the stairs with a concussion, and Holly simply gone. The portal had closed, leaving only the evidence of violence and the terrible knowledge that the Upside Down had claimed another member of their family. Nancy's response combined grief and fury in equal measure. She had spent years protecting her family through secrecy, keeping them ignorant of supernatural threats because she believed ignorance offered safety. That illusion died as she knelt beside her bleeding mother, understanding that protection through distance had failed completely. The monsters had come to her home, targeted her little sister, and she hadn't been there to stop it. 11 didn't hesitate. She reached out psychically, sensing the residual energy from the portal, feeling Holly's presence through the dimensional barrier. Without waiting for consensus or approval, she forced the portal to reopen through sheer will, tearing the fabric between worlds to create passage. Nancy started to follow, but 11 gestured her back toward Karen, who needed immediate medical attention that only Nancy could coordinate. 11 stepped through into the Upside Down. Alone, the portal closing behind her as she pursued Holly and the creature that had taken her. Hopper, still somewhere in that twisted dimension from his failed crawl, would learn of 11's presence through consequences rather than coordination. The military monitoring stations detected her psychic signature immediately, their satellite systems designed to track exactly this kind of power manifestation. The Wheeler family, long protected by their children's careful distance from supernatural conflict, now understood viscerally what Mike and Nancy had faced for years. Karen would survive her injuries, though scarred both physically and psychologically. Ted would recover from his concussion, though the memory of his helplessness would haunt him. But Holly's fate remained unknown. The youngest Wheeler lost to a dimension of nightmares because Mr. Whatsit had betrayed the trust she'd placed in his promises of protection. In the Upside Down, two separate pursuits began. The revelations at Hawkins Hospital connected past and present, imaginary friend and ancient evil, child's trust and calculated manipulation. Karen Wheeler had been rushed to emergency surgery, the lacerations across her chest requiring immediate intervention to prevent fatal blood loss. Ted sat in the waiting room with bruised ribs and a concussion that made the fluorescent lights feel like knives, waiting for news about his wife, while trying to process what he had seen in his own bathroom. Nancy and Mike arrived at the hospital with desperate questions and no legal right to access their mother's medical information while she remained unconscious. Nancy's journalism credentials and force of personality eventually convinced a sympathetic nurse to allow brief supervised contact, though official protocols said otherwise. They needed to speak with Karen, needed her to explain what Holly had told her about Mr. Watsit before the abduction made those conversations urgently relevant. The disguise was improvised but effective. Nancy posed as a doctor, white coat borrowed from a supply closet, clipboard carried with the confidence that makes people assume authority. Mike played injured patient, limping dramatically and clutching his ribs in a way that suggested recent trauma requiring Nancy's immediate consultation. The charade got them past the nurse's station and into Karen's recovery room before anyone thought to verify credentials. Karen had survived surgery but remained heavily sedated, the trauma to her body requiring pharmaceutical intervention to manage pain that would otherwise be unbearable. She couldn't speak, her throat too damaged from screaming, and the intubation that had kept her breathing during the operation. Nancy held up a clipboard and pen, her hands shaking with the effort of maintaining clinical detachment while looking at her mother's bandaged chest. The questions Nancy asked were specific, informed by Mike's accounts of Holly's months of conversations with the invisible friend. Could Karen describe Mr. Watsit? Had Holly mentioned his appearance, his manner of speaking, any details beyond the name? Karen's hand moved slowly across the paper, exhaustion and medication making coordination difficult, but determination drove her to communicate what Holly had shared. Tall, vest, pocket watch. The words appeared in Karen's uncertain handwriting, each letter a struggle. Nancy felt her stomach drop as the description emerged, too specific to dismiss as childish invention. Holly had described not a fantasy guardian, but someone who matched historical records Nancy had reviewed while researching the Creel family during Season 4's investigations. The name came last, Karen's hand barely able to maintain pen pressure as she wrote, Henry. That single word transformed everything. Mr. Watsit wasn't an imaginary friend or even a supernatural entity separate from the threats they already faced. Holly's protective guardian was Henry Creel, the boy who had become Vecna, the monster who had manipulated a 7-year-old's trust to gain access to the Wheeler home and accomplish the abduction they'd failed to prevent. Mike's reaction combined horror and guilt. He had given Holly the paladin figure, had told her to be brave, had reinforced her belief that protection was possible against the threats surrounding them. His attempt to comfort had instead helped maintain the trust that Vecna had exploited. The revelation that Mr. Watsit was Henry Creel meant months of conversations had been grooming, preparation for this moment when Holly would be vulnerable enough to take. Nancy's investigative instincts activated despite emotional turmoil. She photographed Karen's written responses, documented the timeline of Holly's interactions with Mr. Watsit, began constructing the narrative that would help them understand Vecna's strategy. If he had spent months building relationship with Holly, the abduction wasn't impulsive violence, but calculated step in larger plan. Holly herself existed in a space that defied simple categorization as either the upside down or the waking world. The Demogorgon had taken her through a portal, but she hadn't emerged in the decayed reflection of Hawkins that 11 was searching. Instead, Holly found herself standing before the Creel house as it had existed in its prime, before murders and madness had stained its walls with tragedy. The restoration was perfect. Paint gleamed on exterior walls that Holly had seen only as peeling and weathered. Gardens bloomed with flowers in arrangements that suggested wealth and care. Windows glowed with warm light rather than broken darkness. Everything about the scene suggested safety, beauty, home as it should be, rather than horror as it had become. Henry Creel waited on the porch in the form Holly knew as Mr. Whatsit. He wore his vest and pocket watch, smiled with the gentleness he'd always shown her, extended his hand in welcome rather than threat. His voice carried the same reassuring tone he'd used during months of conversations, promising that this place would keep her safe, that her family would join her soon, that the monsters couldn't reach them here. The Creel house that Holly entered existed only in Vecna's mindscape, a psychological construct created from Henry's memories of his childhood before everything went wrong. This wasn't the physical, house rotting in the upside down or standing abandoned in Hawkins. This was mental space, consciousness made architecture, the realm where Vecna kept his victims while their bodies remained trapped in the flesh walls of his physical lair. The distinction between reality and illusion meant nothing to Holly. She experienced the restored Creel house as solid and real, accepted Henry's explanations about saving her from danger, trusted that her parents would recover and join her in this beautiful place once they were well enough to travel. Vecna had created the perfect prison by making it feel like salvation. Holly remained trapped in an illusion crafted specifically for her, while in the waking world, her family pieced together the scope of Vecna's plan. As the group absorbed Holly's danger, other threads demanded attention. Will Byers' connection to the Upside Down, severed imperfectly years before, revealed itself as something far more complex than a lingering symptom of possession. The radio station where he waited with Joyce and Robin had become the site of his latest episode. The vision of the Demogorgon attack leaving him shaken and struggling to articulate what he'd experienced. Joyce held him close, her protective instincts warring with the knowledge that Will's unique awareness might be their only advantage. The explanation came haltingly as Will tried to describe sensations that had no adequate vocabulary. He hadn't merely seen through the Demogorgon's eyes during the convoy attack, he had thought through its mind, experienced its purpose and intention as if they were his own thoughts temporarily borrowed. The creature wasn't acting on base hunger or instinct. It followed orders with understanding, executing a plan handed down through the hive mind that connected Vecna to all his creatures. Joyce asked the questions a mother would ask. Was he hurt? Did the connection cause him physical pain? Could he break it if he needed to? Will's answers provided little comfort. The connection didn't hurt in conventional ways, but it drained him, left him exhausted, as if he'd been running for miles. He wasn't certain he could break it voluntarily. The link activated when Vecna directed attention through the hive mind toward targets near Will's location. The difference from previous experiences troubled Will most. During his possession, in Season 2, the Mind Flayer had controlled him, used him as spy and occasionally puppet. The connection had been invasive, something forced upon him that required the group's intervention to break. This felt different, more like eavesdropping on a conversation he wasn't meant to hear rather than being forced to participate in actions against his will. Will confessed something he had been reluctant to admit for months. He had never felt the connection truly break. After Joyce and Jonathan drove the Mind Flayer from his body through heat and desperation in Season 2, everyone had assumed the bond was severed. Will had wanted to believe it, had gone along with that assumption because the alternative was too frightening to confront. But even then, he had felt something remaining, a whisper of connection too faint to mention, but never fully absent. California had provided relief, not through healing, but through distance. Living across the country from Hawkins meant living far from the Upside Down's strongest influence, far from the gate where Vecna's attention focused. The connection hadn't broken. It had simply stretched thin enough to become ignorable background noise rather than overwhelming signal. Returning to Hawkins had brought him back within range, and the connection had strengthened accordingly. Robin had been listening to this explanation with the analytical mind that made her excellent at pattern recognition. She offered a theory that made immediate, terrible sense. Will was functioning as an antenna, a receiver picking up broadcasts from the hive mind whether he wanted to or not. His proximity to upside-down activity and his previous infection had left him permanently tuned to Vecna's frequency. The antenna metaphor resonated with Will's experience. He wasn't being controlled or possessed. He was receiving transmissions, picking up signals that Vecna sent to his creatures without realizing a human consciousness could intercept them. The Demogorgon hadn't known Will was seeing through its eyes. Vecna likely remained unaware that his commands were being monitored by someone who could warn his enemies. This realization transformed Will's connection from pure liability into potential asset. If he could reliably sense when Vecna directed his creatures toward specific targets, the group would gain advance warning of attacks. They could prepare defenses, evacuate intended victims, possibly even set traps using the intelligence Will's unwilling eavesdropping provided. The antenna that picked up enemy signals could guide their resistance. Joyce rejected this strategic thinking immediately. She'd already lost Will to the Upside Down once, watched him suffer through possession that had nearly destroyed him. The idea of deliberately using his connection, of placing him in positions where he would experience the hive mind's activity, felt like volunteering her son as bait. She wouldn't allow it, wouldn't risk him regardless of tactical advantages. The tension between protection and necessity defined their argument. Will himself insisted he wanted to help, that sitting safely while others faced danger felt worse than any discomfort the connection caused him. Robin pointed out that they needed every advantage against an enemy who had been planning for years. Joyce maintained that Will had already sacrificed enough, that other methods existed for gathering intelligence without deliberately exposing him to psychological trauma. The debate would continue, but immediate crisis demanded action. Holly remained missing. Hopper was trapped in the Upside Down. The antenna theory provided explanation, but no immediate solution. The surface team strategized, but Eleven and Hopper were discovering their own unsettling truths. The Upside Down's geography revealed new mysteries, as Eleven and Hopper, separated from their allies, encountered a barrier that defied all previous understanding of the dimension structure. 11 had found Hopper injured among the convoy wreckage, his leg badly bruised from the escape, but functional enough to continue. They had argued briefly about her impulsive entry into the dimension, Hopper's anger masking his relief that she was alive, before necessity demanded they move forward together. The wounded Demogorgon from the convoy attack had left a blood trail through the corrupted landscape, dark fluid that steamed in the perpetual cold of the alternate dimension. 11 believed following this trail would lead them to Holly, reasoning that the creature would return to wherever it had been sent from, likely the same location where Holly had been taken. The logic was sound enough that Hopper accepted it, despite his reservations about tracking an injured predator through its own territory. The blood led them away from familiar sections of inverted Hawkins toward areas they hadn't explored during previous missions. The landscape grew stranger the farther they travelled, less like a corrupted reflection of their world and more like something independently nightmarish. Buildings ceased matching surface equivalents. Organic structures that resembled architecture but suggested growth rather than construction appeared with increasing frequency. The wall emerged from the perpetual twilight without warning, a barrier that stretched upward until it vanished into the particle-filled sky. Its surface wasn't stone or metal, but flesh pulsing with biological rhythms that suggested life on scales beyond human comprehension. Veins as thick as fire hoses networked across its surface, carrying fluids that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. The texture combined aspects of bark, skin, and coral into something that belonged to no earthly category. 11 approached the wall cautiously, extending one hand toward its surface without quite making contact. She could feel power radiating from it, magic that wasn't hers but which resonated with her abilities in ways that made her uncomfortable. The wall wasn't merely physical barrier, but psychological one, constructed to contain or protect something on the other side. Its purpose remained unclear, but intentionality was evident in every aspect of its design. Hopper's tactical mind processed the wall's implications. If it circled the upside down, as its appearance suggested, it divided Vecna's territory into inner and outer zones. Everything they had explored during the crawls existed outside this barrier. Whatever lay within might be Vecna's true stronghold, the heart of his operation, protected by this organic rampart that would resist conventional breach attempts. The debate about whether to attempt breaking through the wall never reached conclusion. Military vehicles appeared in the distance, their headlights cutting through the dim atmosphere. The facility the military had established in the Upside Down operated nearby, its personnel conducting whatever experiments or operations they pursued within this hostile dimension. 11 and Hopper had been detected, their presence triggering security protocols designed specifically to capture or neutralize unauthorized intruders. The attempted capture became instead a kidnapping in reverse. Hopper had learned guerrilla tactics during his time as a prisoner in the Upside Down earlier in the series. Knowledge that served him well now. He ambushed one of the soldiers who had separated from his unit, subduing him with efficiency born from experience. 11 provided covering fire in the form of telekinetic barriers that deflected the bullets their pursuers fired in their direction. Lieutenant Akers became their unwilling source of information. The soldier, played by Alex Bro, who had performed in the Stranger Things stage play The First Shadow, carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to following orders without questioning their moral implications. He wore the uniform of the military force occupying Hawkins, but displayed specialized equipment that suggested training beyond standard combat operations. The interrogation began in a sheltered location, far from the military patrol routes. Hopper asked direct questions about the wall, about what the military knew regarding Vecna's survival, about the facility's true purpose in the Upside Down. Akers refused to answer, citing security clearances and operational security protocols that meant nothing in their current situation. His resistance was professional rather than personal, the response of someone trained to withstand questioning. Hopper's warning that 11 could enter Akers' mind shifted the dynamic immediately. The soldier's professional composure cracked as he understood the threat wasn't physical torture, but mental invasion, the violation of consciousness itself. 11 prepared to use her abilities not for combat, but for extraction of knowledge, a use of her powers that always troubled her, but which circumstances seemed to demand. The vision 11 experienced when entering Akers' memories provided crucial intelligence. She saw the Gable Ridge Road base from his perspective, the military facility constructed within the Upside Down using materials and methods adapted to hostile environment. She witnessed Dr. K, the scientist portrayed by Linda Hamilton, moving through corridors with authority that suggested command rather than advisory role. Most significantly, she saw the massive metal vault door, sealed and guarded, behind which something or someone powerful resided. Akers panicked when 11's consciousness touched memories of what lay behind that door. His resistance intensified, not from training but from genuine terror of whatever the vault contained. Hopper demanded answers, threatened consequences, but Akers remained more frightened of revealing information than of anything his captors might do to him. The pieces suggested a disturbing possibility. The military wasn't merely studying the Upside Down. They had captured something, someone with power comparable to 11's, and were using or exploiting that power for purposes still unclear. Back in Hawkins, the group formulated a desperate plan. The identification of Derek Turnbow as Vecna's next target transformed theoretical strategy into immediate action, moral complexity intersecting with practical necessity. Derek had appeared in Holly's life as a classmate, though calling their relationship friendship would misrepresent the dynamic. He had bullied Holly with the casual cruelty that some children mistake for social dominance, making her school days more difficult through insults and exclusion. Will's sensing of Derek as the next target came through the hive-mind connection during another episode at the radio station. The vision showed Derek sleeping in his bedroom, Vecna's attention focusing on the boy with the same predatory calculation that had preceded Holly's abduction. Will emerged from the trance with Derek's name and address, information that should have been impossible for him to possess but which the hive mind had transmitted clearly. The group gathered at the radio station to debate response options. The obvious choice involved warning Derek's family about supernatural threat and hoping they would accept protection from strangers claiming their son faced interdimensional abduction. Past experience suggested this approach would fail, parents either dismissing the warning as prank or contacting authorities who would interfere rather than help. Protection required methods that skirted or violated laws designed for normal circumstances. Mike proposed the plan that would ultimately be adopted, though not without significant ethical debate. They would render the Turnbow family unconscious using drugs obtained from the hospital, remove Derek to a secure location, and set a trap at his home for the Demogorgon that Vecna would inevitably send. The creature would arrive expecting to find Derek sleeping in his bed, and instead encounter defences designed to injure it and attach a tracking device that would lead the group to Vecna's actual location. The moral implications troubled everyone, except perhaps Dustin, whose grief over Eddie's death had left him willing to pursue any strategy that might lead to Vecna's destruction. They would be kidnapping a child and his family, drugging them without consent, using them as bait in a trap that might fail catastrophically. The fact that their intentions involved protection rather than harm didn't erase the reality that they were planning criminal acts against innocent people. Nancy argued that Holly's abduction had already demonstrated the inadequacy of conventional protection methods. Vecna would take Derek regardless of warnings or precautions his family might attempt. Their intervention, however ethically questionable, represented Derek's best chance of survival and their best opportunity to locate Holly before Vecna's plan progressed further. Necessity didn't make the plan right, but it made alternatives worse. Now the execution required someone the Turnbow family would trust enough to allow into their home. Erica Sinclair provided the solution despite her initial reluctance to participate. She had been friends with Derek's sister Tina before the gates opened and social dynamics shifted under quarantine pressure. The friendship had cooled but not broken completely, making Erica's appearance at their door with a pie plausible rather than suspicious. Robin and Will obtained the necessary sedatives from the hospital through careful theft that avoided detection. The dosages had been calculated based on approximate weights and ages, enough to induce unconsciousness without causing harm. The drugs were baked into a pie that Murray had prepared, his culinary skills employed for purposes he had never imagined when learning to cook. Erica's performance at the Turnbow house demonstrated why the group valued her, despite her youth. She presented the pie as peace offering, explained that recent events had made her appreciate old friendships, and spoke with the sincerity that children can deploy when properly motivated. The Turnbow family accepted both pie and explanation, inviting Erica to join them for dinner and dessert. The plan encountered its first complication when Tina refused her slice, claiming concern about calories despite being 12 years old and displaying no indication of actual dietary restriction. The family ate while Tina watched, the sedatives taking effect within minutes as planned. Erica found herself alone with an unconscious family except for Tina, who was beginning to recognize that something was wrong with her parents and brother. Erica's quick thinking prevented disaster. She had brought a syringe with additional sedative as backup, hidden in her jacket pocket. When Tina started screaming, Erica managed to inject her before the noise could alert neighbours or passing military patrols. The ethical violation compounded, but the mission demanded completion once initiated. The group moved quickly after Erica signalled success. They loaded the unconscious Turnbow family into the WSQK van that Robin and Steve had modified for exactly this kind of operation. Joyce drove them to the McCorkle farm on Hawkins' outskirts, an abandoned property that offered isolation and security. Will and Robin stayed to monitor the family while the others prepared the trap. The Turnbow house received treatment inspired by Home Alone, the holiday classic that several group members had watched repeatedly during childhood. Trip wires connected to shotgun shells loaded with tracking, mobile devices. Grenades positioned for maximum effect without destroying the building. Nancy's rifle set up in Derek's bedroom for direct engagement. The preparations took hours, everyone working with desperate efficiency. The streetlights flickering that evening signalled the Demogorgon's approach, the electrical disturbance preceding dimensional breach as it always did. Steve and Dustin monitored from Steve's car, equipment spread across the dashboard tracking movement through the neighbourhood. The creature materialised in Derek's bedroom as predicted, a portal opening in the ceiling that had become Vecna's preferred entry method. Nancy fired the tracking shell, the modified ammunition striking the Demogorgon's shoulder and embedding the device beneath its hide. Jonathan threw the grenades as the creature realised the deception, explosions driving it back toward the portal. The trap had worked precisely as designed, injuring the creature and marking it for tracking without alerting Vecna to the full scope of their strategy. Steve and Dustin followed the signal as the Demogorgon retreated into the Upside Down, the tracker broadcasting its location clearly through dimensional barriers. They drove through Hawkins streets, tracking movement that led away from familiar areas towards sections they hadn't yet mapped. Hope surged that they would finally locate Vecna's stronghold, find Holly and the other children, end the threat before more families suffered. Will's warning came too late to prevent the disaster already unfolding. Derek had awakened at the McCorkle farm, his metabolism processing the sedative faster than the calculations had predicted. The moment his consciousness returned, Vecna saw through his eyes the barn where they had hidden him. The tracker they had placed on the Demogorgon became irrelevant as Vecna directed it toward the actual target location. The brief hope shattered as the signal reversed direction, the creature abandoning its retreat to pursue new orders toward the farm where Derek's awareness had betrayed their position. As the Demogorgon redirected, Will's connection intensified to levels that would change everything. Two explorations of consciousness unfolded simultaneously, separated by dimensions but connected through Vecna's grand design. Eleven's psychic invasion of Lieutenant Acker's memories occurred in the physical Upside Down, while Holly's encounter with an unexpected companion took place within the mental landscape that Vecna had constructed from his own fractured recollections. Eleven's ability to enter minds differed fundamentally from Vecna's methods. Where he forced himself into consciousness and twisted it to his purposes, 11 moved through the void, a black psychic space where she could observe memories without necessarily controlling the person experiencing them. The technique required concentration and left her vulnerable while projecting, but it offered access to information that no amount of physical interrogation could extract. Acker's mind resisted her presence initially, his training providing some psychological defense against intrusion. However, military preparation for resisting interrogation assumed conventional methods, human questioners with limited time and resources. 11's patient exploration of his consciousness eventually found pathways through his resistance, following the neural patterns that led toward memories he most wanted to hide. The memory she accessed showed the Gable Ridge road base from Acker's perspective during a routine shift. The facility existed entirely within the Upside Down, a compound constructed using materials that could survive the dimensions hostile environment. Military personnel moved through corridors that looked almost normal, despite being surrounded by decayed reality, their operations maintaining surprising order within chaos. Dr. K appeared in the memory, the scientist played by Linda Hamilton, moving with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute command. She wore a lab coat over military fatigues, the combination suggesting her role bridged scientific research and operational command. Her age and bearing reminded Eleven uncomfortably of Dr. Brenner, though their styles differed significantly. Where Brenner had masked cruelty with paternal affection, Dr. K's approach seemed more direct, less interested in emotional manipulation than in efficient exploitation of available resources. The vault door dominated the memory's focus, a massive metal barrier that required multiple security clearances to access. Dr. K entered codes that Akers didn't know, submitted to biometric scans that verified her identity through methods beyond simple fingerprints. The door opened ponderously, revealing a chamber beyond that the memory didn't fully capture before Akers' attention shifted elsewhere. 11 pushed deeper, trying to see what lay beyond that door, but Akers' panic intensified proportionally to her proximity to that specific information. His terror wasn't professional concern about revealing classified information. This was visceral fear of something that had traumatized him on fundamental level, something his mind had tried to wall off from conscious thought for protection rather than security. Hopper's voice penetrated 11's concentration, demanding to know what she was seeing. She withdrew partially from the void to communicate, telling him about the vault and the powerful being she sensed imprisoned within it. Her assumption that Vecna himself might be contained there made logical sense given the context. The military had been hunting 11. If they'd succeeded in capturing similar power, keeping it locked away for study or exploitation would follow naturally. Meanwhile, in Vecna's mindscape, Holly Wheeler experienced a reality that existed only as mental construct. The restored Creel house that surrounded her felt solid to her perception, every detail rendered with perfect fidelity to Henry's childhood memories. She had been exploring the house at Mr. Watsit's encouragement, discovering rooms filled with toys and books, a childhood preserved in amber before tragedy corrupted everything. The note she found had been placed deliberately, left where Holly would discover it during her exploration. The paper looked old, the ink faded as if the message had been waiting decades. It showed a crude map marking a location in the woods behind the house, with instructions written in child's handwriting that suggested someone else was hiding nearby, someone who needed help escaping from monsters in the forest. Holly's decision to venture into the woods demonstrated both the bravery that ran in her family and the vulnerability of trusting a child's judgment in supernatural circumstances. Mr. Watsit had warned her about monsters in the forest, which made the note's claim that someone needed rescue more compelling rather than less. Heroes didn't let warnings prevent them from helping people in danger, a lesson she had absorbed from years of watching her siblings' secretive behaviour. The woods beyond the Creel house matched no earthly forest. Trees grew in impossible geometries, their branches connecting in patterns that suggested consciousness rather than random growth. The ground shifted subtly beneath Holly's feet, never quite solid, never quite liquid. The sky above showed stars that moved in patterns no astronomer would recognize, constellations from imagination rather than cosmos. Holly found Max Mayfield at the location the map indicated, standing near a wall of rock that jutted from the forest floor like bone protruding through skin. Max looked exactly as Holly remembered her from brief previous encounters, though wearing the clothes she'd died in at the end of Season 4. Her presence here defied easy explanation, but the mindscape operated on dream logic, where encountering impossible people in impossible places felt natural rather than alarming. Max's surprise at seeing Holly suggested she hadn't sent the note, hadn't known another person would be brought to this mental prison. She'd been alone in Vecna's mindscape since her near-death experience, navigating memories and constructed spaces while trying to find escape routes that might exist only in her desperate hope. Holly's arrival meant Vecna had captured another victim, expanding his collection of trapped consciousness for purposes Max could only guess at. The rock wall where Max had positioned herself seemed to serve as boundary within the mindscape, a location Vecna couldn't or wouldn't enter. Max had discovered this sanctuary through trial and error, learning the geography of mental prison through exploration that had consumed subjective weeks or months, while her physical body lay comatose in a hospital bed. Two discoveries in separate realms pointed toward Vecna's larger design: the imprisoned powerful being behind the vault, and Max's conscious presence trapped in his mental landscape. The gate to the Max Zed opened as it had countless times before, but what emerged on this November evening was not supply convoy or reconnaissance team, but evil incarnate in transformed flesh. The military had grown complacent through routine, soldiers expecting the usual threats they had been trained to handle. Vecna's appearance shattered that complacency within seconds of his passage through the dimensional threshold. Derek Turnbow had awakened at the McCorkle farm, where Joyce, Robin, Erica and Will maintained watch over the unconscious family. The boy's confusion transformed rapidly into panic as he recognized his captors as the people he'd been warned about, the ones Mr. Watsit had described as dangerous. His struggles against the restraints they'd applied drew attention just as the Demogorgon's new trajectory became apparent through Will's increasingly intense connection to the hive mind. The creature crashed through the barn's wall rather than entering through doors, its violence announcing purpose before anyone inside could prepare adequate defense. Joyce positioned herself between the Demogorgon and Derek, armed with nothing but determination and a pitchfork she grabbed from the barn's collection of rusted farm implements. The weapon seemed laughable against a creature that had survived military ordnance, but maternal instinct demanded action, regardless of odds. Steve and the others arrived in time to prevent catastrophe, their car striking the Demogorgon with enough force to knock it away from Joyce. The creature opened a portal back to the Upside Down in the barn's floor, retreating from coordinated defense while remaining focused on its mission. Derek watched this rescue with dawning comprehension that the people who had kidnapped him had also just saved his life from the exact threat they'd warned him about. The attack at the Maxi base unfolded simultaneously, Vecna having planned coordinated strikes that would overwhelm the group's ability to respond effectively. The gate opened for a scheduled burn, military personnel preparing for routine supply transfer, when Vecna himself walked through with the deliberate menace that the Duffer Brothers had specifically designed to evoke Darth Vader's entrance in Rogue One. A Star Wars story. Vecna's appearance had transformed since his last confrontation with Nancy, Steve and Robin at the Creel house. The fire that had consumed him at the end of Season 4 had changed his physical form, making him simultaneously more monstrous and more powerful. His frame appeared elongated, stretched in ways that defied human anatomy. Spines protruded from his body at angles suggesting both armor and weapon. The burned flesh had regenerated into something that looked more like bark than skin, organic plating that would resist damage more effectively than his previous form. The soldiers recognized threat immediately, but found their training insufficient against reality that exceeded their worst briefings. Vecna moved through their defensive positions with contemptuous ease, telekinesis throwing bodies aside like toys, while his physical strikes demonstrated strength beyond natural limits. Weapons fire that should have stopped any earthly threat passed through him or bounced off his transformed hide without causing meaningful damage. The systematic nature of Vecna's attack revealed calculation rather than rage. He killed when necessary to advance his purposes, but showed no interest in wholesale slaughter for its own sake. His target was the children the military had gathered from Hawkins' families during their medical screenings, young people whose psychological profiles suggested vulnerability that Vecna could exploit for his larger design. Robin Buckley and Murray Bauman had positioned themselves near the holding area where these children waited, their presence there part of a broader rescue plan that Vecna's arrival had accelerated catastrophically. They attempted to evacuate the children, using the chaos as cover, loading them into a truck and driving toward exits that might already be compromised by demogorgons responding to their master's call. Derek Turnbow's transformation from victim to ally occurred gradually during the violence at the farm. He had spent months trusting Mr. Watsit's guidance, believing the warnings about monsters and the people who would try to hurt him. Seeing the Demogorgon attack, watching Joyce risk her life to protect him, understanding that everything Mr. Watsit had told him was inverted truth, finally broke through the manipulation. He volunteered to help using the persona he'd adopted for school plays. Delightful Derek, the charming version of himself that could convince people of almost anything. Mike Wheeler's leadership emerged naturally during the crisis, his experience coordinating supernatural resistance across multiple seasons finally crystallizing into confident command. He organized one group of rescued children, creating a route through the Max Zed that would avoid Vecna's attention while heading toward relative safety. His planning incorporated lessons from previous battles, understanding that survival required thinking several moves ahead of an enemy who held overwhelming advantage in direct confrontation. Lucas Sinclair led a second group through the underground tunnels that honeycombed the area beneath Hawkins, passages that predated the military occupation and offered hidden routes away from the base. His knowledge of these tunnels from Season 2 provided advantage that saved lives, each child following his instructions with trust, earned through his steady competence under pressure. Vecna's attention focused on Will Byers, with recognition that transcended their previous encounters. He lifted Will telekinetically, suspending the boy in air while speaking with the terrible intimacy of someone addressing property rather than person. His speech about children's minds breaking easily referenced not just Holly and Derek, but Will himself, the first child Vecna had deliberately infected and the foundation for everything that followed. The monologue Vecna delivered explained his strategy with the arrogance of someone who believed victory was already assured. Children's consciousness was malleable, easier to reshape than adult minds that had calcified into rigid patterns. He could take their fears and traumas, could amplify their vulnerabilities, could transform them into extensions of his will that would spread throughout Hawkins like infection. Will had been his proof of concept, the experiment that demonstrated what was possible. Now he would expand that success across dozens of young minds simultaneously. The speech connected explicitly to the Season 5 opening flashback, Vecna reminding Will of their first meeting in November 1983, when he had promised they would do beautiful things together. That promise was being fulfilled now, though Will himself had proven disappointingly resistant to complete corruption. The other children would be more successful subjects, or so Vecna believed, with the certainty of someone who had never truly understood the human capacity for resistance. Vecna's withdrawal back into the Upside Down was strategic rather than forced. His mission accomplished despite the opposition. He had demonstrated his power, taken the children he came for, and left the military base in shambles. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, no amount of military force provided protection, and his plan would proceed regardless of their attempts at interference. In the moment of greatest despair, unexpected power awakened. The boy who had been taken first, possessed longest, and suffered most discovered within himself a power born not from training, but from trauma transformed into strength. Demogorgons had breached the Maxer perimeter in numbers that overwhelmed remaining military resistance. Their coordination, suggesting intelligence, directing multiple creatures simultaneously toward specific objectives. Robin, Mike, and Lucas found themselves cornered with rescued children, weapons exhausted, retreat paths blocked by monsters that moved with predatory certainty. Will experienced the attack through multiple perspectives simultaneously, his connection to the hive mind forcing him to witness through the eyes of creatures hunting his friends. The sensation was overwhelming, consciousness fragmenting across numerous viewpoints while maintaining enough coherence to understand what was happening. He saw Robin raising her arms to shield children behind her. He felt the Demogorgon's hunger and purpose intertwining into mission that would end in blood. Mike's voice penetrated Will's paralysis, calling to him not with panic but with recognition. Mike had always understood Will better than anyone, had seen past the victim label to the person struggling beneath trauma's weight. His words referenced Dungeons and Dragons, the game that had given them language for concepts otherwise too complex for children to articulate. He reminded Will of the difference between wizards and sorcerers, between those who learned magic through study and those who possessed it innately. A wizard learns, a sorcerer simply is. The distinction crystallized something in Will's understanding of his situation. He hadn't been infected with power that could be removed or exorcised. Vecna's intrusion in 1983 had awakened something already latent, had activated abilities that were fundamentally part of who Will was, rather than contamination from outside. The hive mind connection wasn't purely Vecna's tool imposed on unwilling victim. It was bridge that Will himself could cross, channel that flowed both directions if he possessed courage to attempt control. Robin's voice joined Mike's, encouraging Will to be himself rather than trying to become something he wasn't. The advice seemed counterintuitive given the circumstances, but its wisdom ran deeper than surface meaning. Will had spent years trying to suppress or deny the connection to the upside down, treating it as shameful secret rather than integral aspect of his identity. Acceptance didn't mean surrender. It meant acknowledging reality and choosing how to respond. Will reached for happy memories, following instinct rather than plan. He thought of Castle Byers, the fort he'd built in his backyard that had represented sanctuary and imagination before the upside down corrupted everything. He remembered afternoons spent with Mike creating campaigns and characters, friendship that had sustained him through terrors his friends couldn't fully comprehend. These memories became anchors, points of light in darkness that defined who Will was beyond victim, beyond antenna, beyond the frightened boy everyone tried to protect. The power accessed through the hive mind felt like Vecna's in signature, but different in application. Will's eyes turned white as Eleven's did when she used her abilities, though the mechanism differed from her telekinesis. He could see through the Demogorgon's perspectives, not as passive observer, but as potential controller, consciousness that could override their instructions with sufficient will and purpose. His arms moved in gestures that mimicked Vecna's signature motions, muscle memory borrowed through the hive mind connection. The Demogorgons attacking Robin froze mid-lunge, their bodies locked by Will's psychic interference with the signals controlling them. He twisted his hands sharply, and the creature's limbs responded to his command rather than Vecna's, breaking at joints with sounds that echoed across the battlefield. One by one, Will neutralized the Demogorgons, threatening his friends, channeling power through the very connection Vecna had created to harm him. The effort drained him rapidly, nosebleed beginning as it always did when 11 pushed her abilities to their limits. His body wasn't accustomed to this level of psychic exertion, each gesture costing energy he barely possessed. When the immediate threats had been eliminated, Will collapsed to his knees, wiping blood from his face with his sleeve, in gesture that mirrored countless moments of watching 11 recover from similar efforts. The group surrounded him with questions and concern, but also with dawning understanding of what his awakening meant for their chances against Vecna. Mike's assessment captured the shift in their strategic position succinctly. They had two 11s now, two people with abilities that could engage Vecna on psychological battlefield where conventional weapons meant nothing. Will's power operated differently from 11's telekinesis, working through the hive mind that Vecna himself had created, but the net effect doubled their offensive capabilities against enemy who had previously held overwhelming advantage. Vecna's emergence confirmed every fear, while Will's powers offered unexpected hope, but one final revelation waited in the Upside Down. The vault that 11 feared contained Vecna, held instead a figure from her past, a sister thought lost, a power the military had captured, for purposes still unclear. Hopper had returned to 11 after his reconnaissance of the military base's deeper levels, his expression suggesting discovery rather than dead end. He led her through corridors that twisted deeper into the facility, past security checkpoints they disabled through combination of his tactical knowledge and her telekinetic force. The vault door stood exactly as Acre's memory had shown, massive and imposing, secured by technology designed to contain something dangerous. Hopper worked on the locking mechanisms, using techniques he'd learned during his time in various forms of captivity, while 11 provided the raw power necessary to override systems built to resist conventional breach attempts. The door opened with hydraulic hiss that suggested it had been sealed for considerable time. The chamber beyond held not Vecna, but Kali Prasad, known to Hawkins' lab as Subject 8, the girl with power to create illusions who had befriended 11 during Season 2's controversial 7th episode. Her head had been shaved recently, evidence of ongoing experimentation. Machines surrounded her, equipment that seemed designed to measure or possibly extract her abilities. She appeared unconscious or sedated, her body suspended in apparatus that looked more like torture device than medical equipment. 11's recognition was immediate and visceral. Kali represented one of the few people who truly understood what 11 had experienced, someone who had survived the same childhood horrors at Brenner's hands. Their reunion in Chicago during Season 2 had been brief but meaningful, Kali encouraging 11 toward anger and vengeance, while 11 ultimately chose different path. They had parted with mutual respect despite philosophical differences, two survivors taking separate routes toward healing. The discovery of Kali imprisoned here answered questions about how the military had developed technology capable of neutralizing 11's powers. The satellite systems that created interference, preventing her from using abilities, were based on Kali's illusion magic, her power to manipulate perception, weaponized into devices that could scramble psychic signals. Dr. K's operation had captured one powerful subject to develop countermeasures against another. 11 approached Kali's suspended form carefully, reaching out to touch her sister's face. Kali's eyes opened at the contact, recognition flickering across features that had aged slightly in the years since their last meeting. No words passed between them initially, the emotional weight of reunion transcending language. 11 had found family she thought lost, while Kali discovered that rescue had finally come after however long she'd been imprisoned. Hopper assessed the equipment keeping Kali sedated and restrained, determining what needed to be disabled to free her safely. The process would take time they might not have. Military personnel surely responding to alarms their breach had triggered. 11 made the decision to prioritize Kali's rescue over their original mission of finding Holly, understanding that leaving her sister in captivity was unacceptable, regardless of other objectives. The Duffer brothers had explained in interviews that bringing Kali back represented closing a narrative loop that had frustrated fans since Season 2. The Lost Sister episode had been controversial for interrupting Season 2's momentum, but leaving Carly's story unresolved would have been worse. Her return in Season 5 provided both tactical asset and emotional resonance, reuniting Eleven with someone who understood her in ways even her friends couldn't fully grasp. Carly's abilities would prove crucial against Vecna in ways that Volume 2 would reveal. Her power to create illusions could show him his worst memories, could trap him in psychological prisons of his own making. Combined with Eleven's telekinesis and Will's hive mind access, they would form a trio capable of engaging Vecna across multiple dimensions of conflict simultaneously. The implications extended beyond tactical advantage. Eleven had spent years as the only one of Brenner's subjects known to have survived, carrying survivor's guilt about the massacre she believed Henry had committed. Finding Kaylee alive meant that perhaps others had survived too, that the family Brenner had torn apart might be partially recoverable. This hope would drive Eleven forward even as darker revelations approached. Kaylee's return transformed their resources and raised stakes for Volume 2. 3 powerful minds preparing to face the darkness together. With pieces assembled and powers awakened, Volume 1 drew toward its close. And so our journey through Volume 1 concludes. 4 chapters that assembled pieces for battles still to come. Will Byers, the boy whose disappearance began everything, stood transformed into sorcerer who could wield connection meant to destroy him. 11 found her sister Carly after years of separation, their reunion promising power enough to challenge even Vecna's darkness. Holly remained trapped in mindscape illusion while Max waited in consciousness prison, both girls demonstrating resilience that would prove crucial. The group had learned that nowhere offered safety, that home itself could become battlefield, that children bore weight adults had failed to lift. Yet they also discovered resources they hadn't known existed, abilities awakening precisely when desperation demanded them most. Volume 2 would arrive on Christmas Day with 3 more chapters. The finale would follow on New Year's Eve, bringing this story home at last. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be filled with the courage that defeats monsters, the friendship that survives darkness, and the hope that even in nightmare dimensions, light finds its way home. The story continues, but for now, rest peacefully in the knowledge that heroes rise when needed most.